Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our live learning session this afternoon. Feel free to put your cameras on if you'd like us to see your beautiful faces today. Would be great if you'd hit mute as you're jumping in as well, in case you're having conversations with teenagers about getting afternoon tea. Probably the whole room doesn't necessarily need to hear that this afternoon, although depending on the snack, maybe we'd be up for it. Great to see such an amazing turnout today.
We want to push a little bit to try to group them together.
Just hit mute, everybody. As your first call to action, hit the little mute button. Welcome to our live learning session this afternoon. My name is Nick Dyson. I'm the CEO and founder of Mute. Definitely snack time. I'm the CEO and founder of Future Anything. And we have a jam-packed afternoon set for you with a pretty awesome guest. So to kick off, I just want to take a second to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land in which we're living, working, playing, learning, creating. And I would love to know where in the world you're joining us from. I'm coming from Meanjin on Yagara and Turrbal land in Brisbane, where Future Anything is headquartered. If you've got a second, I would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know who you are. Maybe tell us a little bit about your role, whether you're in education or otherwise. And please let us know what land you're coming to us from. A lot of the time when I start workshops or professional learning, I love to show a picture of, the very traditional Australian map and then a map of Indigenous Australia. And my point of reflection is always to think about the gap between how old we were when we first saw this map of Australia and then maybe how old we were when we saw the map of Indigenous Australia. And for me, there was 25 years gap between seeing that first map and that second map. But what I find fascinating is when I work in rooms full of young people, the gap between the first map and the second map is really close together. So I think one of the challenges we have in education is sometimes we feel like this slow moving beast doesn't move fast enough. But when I see little moments like that working with young people, I realize that we've actually made maybe more ground than we think we have in the work that we're doing in our schools, which is really important. So we had a pretty outstanding number of people that registered for this session. I was saying to Selena, we had over 200 people put their hand up, and I said that this clearly isn't about everybody's love for me. It is most evidently everyone's love for Selena. So I'm going to do less talking today and open up the floor for Selena to do lots of talking. And one thing that we share in common is maybe a mild dislike bordering on hatred of bio reads. So I'm definitely not going to read Selena's bio because I kind of feel like it's the same thing as when people sing happy birthday to you. It's really hard to know where to look. It's just that little bit awkward. However, I am going to throw Selena a bit of a question, which hopefully will reveal maybe a little bit of the stuff that sits underneath the bio through this question. I know we're here to talk about data, and I will get into the numbers of like the data stuff and the research and like all of the important stuff here. But you've carved out a pretty interesting niche for yourself in change management in schools, right? And I always feel like educators have this origin story, like this moment in their career that kind of is the catalyst for the direction that they take in education. I would love to know, was it some really beautiful spreadsheet that captured your heart and your career? What was the moment that kind of made data your date forever? Alliteration. Gosh, I'm on a roll this afternoon, guys. So Selena, introduce a little bit of yourself, but tell me about that origin moment. What was the moment in time that you can think about that really made this your thing, where you saw, gosh, if there's a change that I want to make in this world, it's got to be down this path?
He's picking you up just after 4.
Yeah, it's
yeah.
If people have heard me speak before, I often talk about the time when I was in the UK and I taught over there for nearly 4 years. And for me, like I'd gone from this context in Australia where there was no data really used in my role beyond some of the assessment data. attendance at co-curricular and that type of thing. And I went into this context in the UK where I got a job as head of phys ed. So I'm PE maths secondary trained.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you want me to pause and just ask people to mute?
Yeah, I think it might be Kristen. I'm just trying to find her little mute button so I can do it. But can you hit mute if you haven't already, just so that we don't, I'm sure you're having a thrilling conversation, but I imagine you probably don't realize that we're listening to it. So if you can hit the mute button, then Selena can tell her story about teaching in the UK. Thanks, everyone.
It's all good. I've spoken over many a teenage boy in my time. So, you know, why not just add some adults in there too?
I feel like teachers are rowdier anyway, if I'm honest, like way rowdier.
Yeah, definitely can be. And so I went into this role in the UK and I applied for a job as head of phys ed, and I really wanted it because I was really interested in middle leadership. And one of the things they said to me in my interview, coming from this context in Australia, that I hadn't really used much data or tracked data all that well or very often, where they basically said 1 in 4 kids have passed this subject generally to date, and your job is to improve the pass rate. So for me, it was a really clear metric that I had to improve. As I said, I'm a netballer, like I taught PE. I'm also inherently very competitive. So I was like, game on. Like, you want me to get more than 1 in 4 kids through the subject, let's do it. And the only way that my brain kind of thought to do that was to track them, because we had really good predicted grades. So they're really problematic. I don't agree with the way that some of those predicted grades were calculated for us in the UK. But it was almost like there were kids predicted A's in PE who really struggled with prac. And I was like, right, well, let's just see if we can make this happen. And how do we do it? And how do I drag that kid to an A? And there were kids who were predicted low results because of their performance in literacy and numeracy, but were amazing athletes. And I was like, right, well, this is just going to look great. Like, let's just, how do we maximize that? And so, yeah, that for me was really transformational. There was a lot of really negative stuff about the way that data was used in the UK in my school context. But at the end of the day, I was having really awesome conversations with young people about their goals and their strengths and their gaps and what they needed to do to achieve their goals and what that would then mean for them post-schooling if they achieved them. It helped me refine what I was doing in the classroom, so I felt more effective. And then when I could actually see the change and I could see the growth in their results, it was a huge like fist bump moment for me, because it was then really professionally rewarding that I'd worked with these young people who had really clear goals and we'd worked on it together, and they'd been able to succeed. So yeah, that was absolutely the catalyst for me.
I also didn't realize that we were both PE teachers, so I'm feeling like a lot of synergy in our stories right now. One of my first PE stories was teaching netball without knowing where the positions were actually supposed to go. And so my key strategy for that was to make one of the students the umpire, because I felt like then I could still hold some degree of authenticity in that space. I want to dig a little bit deeper in that. So I think what's interesting is that you were provided with this incidental opportunity to examine how data might be able to tell your story, but also tell the story of your students. In that first experience, what kind of data did you collect and how? So what did it look like to kind of tell that story in that moment without maybe all of the knowledge that you have now about how to make that a research-backed process? How did you start?
Yeah, so for us, or every single student was predicted a grade in your subject area based on the equivalent of a NAPLAN performance in year 9. So I had that. So that was kind of the big chunky standardized assessment piece, which, as I say, problematic when you're trying to predict a PE outcome from literacy, numeracy, science assessment. I had their previous PE results, and that was kind of like I was grasping at straws. That was kind of all I really had. For some kids, I had obviously data around like EALD status, how long they'd been in the country. Like, we had some recently arrived refugees and asylum seekers in my school. So knowing that context of their English background was really, really important. And we had mock exams because we were prepping for this external exam at the end of year 11. And so that was kind of where I started, to be honest. And then it was just, and it was a process of trial and error. And in my work now, I say all the time, most of us are self-taught. Like, most of us haven't gone through formalized data training. And so it was just, I watched what other people were doing in my school. I saw that they were tracking smaller bits of data along the way. And then I started to think, well, what's going to give me really useful information about my kids so that I can help them succeed? And so that's, I guess, that real, what we talk about now, what I now talk about, and I didn't at the time, but the concept of lag and lead data. So the lag being that big chunky previous historical data that we're hopefully trying to shift, but the lead data are the bits and pieces that are smaller and we can collect along the way. And I often use weight loss analogies, which is probably not right. But, you know, if you're trying to lose 5 kilos, you don't just weigh yourself today and then get on the scales in 2 months' time and hope you've lost it. You're like trying to close your move rings on your Apple Watch, and, you know, you're eating well. And if you don't succeed today, you get up tomorrow and you try again. And it's like, I guess what I started to realize was those lead indicators and those smaller bits of data I was collecting on my students were actually the greatest predictors for me of how they were going to go in that final exam.
Yeah, awesome. I love that idea of lag data and lead data. I think that's really, really helpful. And thinking about that incremental shift, because I think we talk about a lot how it's about really the compounding effect of incremental changes. And so how do we actually use data in a meaningful way to track that progress in a really transparent way? I think that's awesome. I'm really curious because I think when you use the D word in schools, data, guys, I think sometimes there can be a little bit of fear from teachers because it's often something that comes from above, and it's used to maybe, I don't know, weaponized against us to demonstrate whether we're good or effective teachers and whether we've done our job. And your origin story, I think, really highlights how you were able to use data in a way that empowered you as an educator and then also empowered your young people to have agency and ownership of their learning. And I think that's a really critical connection for us to make here. But if we go back to the beginning, you know, and really go back to fundamentals for a second, what is data when we're talking about the school context? What are all the different types of data that we can collect apart from just the standardized assessment results that are perhaps most commonly referenced when it comes to this journey? And when we talk about those different data inputs, why is it so critical that educators reframe their relationship to data? Like, why is the connection and the relationship we have to data so critical in using those inputs as we move along as well?
Yeah, there's so much in that question, right? Can we just talk for the rest of the session on this? No, I'm joking. I won't.
Done.
I can rein it in. Okay, so why do we fear it? I think we've certainly seen it modeled in places like the UK in a really negative way, and even to the extent of performance-based pay. So that's the extreme, I guess, end. And I definitely do not advocate for anything like that, because that whole concept of paying people based on outcomes. And one of the things I always talk about is we should be looking at progress and growth for young people in the same way that we're looking at and celebrating achievement. Yeah, anyway, really problematic. So I don't agree with that. But also in Australia, what we've got is we've got media who report on standardized assessment results and compare schools across the country. There was a news article that came out last year in an education magazine that talked about the top 5 schools in every state and territory in NAPLAN. I hate that use of NAPLAN data. I love NAPLAN data. I can tell us some really useful information about what cohorts and individual students and small groups need. But putting it in a magazine article and comparing schools is not right. And so that is really, and say even that, say the My School website, those kind of practices have really turned people off. And so I actually think that it makes real sense, to be honest, that people go, gosh, I'm not a fan of data. Like, I love what I do. I'm doing my job because I want to make a difference in the lives of young people. These young people in a newspaper are being reduced to a number and we're being compared, and I know how hard I work and I haven't made that list. So I get that kind of stress about that. And I guess we can be mad at that type of the use of that summary statistics for NAPLAN, and at the same time we can hold the belief that it's got real power one-on-one and in a classroom with young people. Whereas there's kind of sometimes this real, it's one or kind of thinking. It's, you know, I hate the media use, so therefore I must hate it in the classroom as well. Another part of the question you asked was then around, well, what is data? And people obviously often assume that I'm talking about numerical, quantitative information that sits in a spreadsheet. And a lot of the time I am talking about that. but that's absolutely not the only type of data that we have. And so there's qualitative data that we have categories in qualitative data. So where we're, say, surveyed and asked to assign a response, like strongly disagree, through to strongly agree. That's qualitative categorical. Our A to E data is actually qualitative, because when we are when we're marking student work and we're assessing the quality of the response against an achievement standard descriptor and against a rubric, like descriptors in a rubric, that's actually a qualitative comparison. And then we have a whole lot of open-ended data as well that's qualitative. So, you think about emails that are sent from parents to students, meeting minutes, we've got individual learning plans and curriculum plans, we've got specialist reports, and all the stuff that's not actually written down. So the things I see happening with young people, the things I know that I've tried and have worked or not really worked, the observations I'm making of class groupings, the interactions I have in the corridor, that's all data. And we really want to be bringing experience. We want to be bringing in our professional experience and the quantitative, because there's kind of this tension between quantitative information, like the numbers, is more objective, so it can be helpful in that way, but it never tells us why something has happened. And that's where qualitative data comes in. So qualitative is more subjective, but it actually explains what's going on. So a go-to example for me in that case would be, like, if you said to me that a young person was suspended 10 times from your school last year, like, that's useful to know, because 10 suspensions is massive. But it doesn't tell me anything about why that might be the case. Like, it doesn't tell me whether it's like disrespect to teachers, whether it's aggression to students, whether it's like refusing to go into a classroom, whether it's damaging school property. Like, I would need to go and read all of that qualitative data that is more subjective. The downside is that is also obviously a lot more time consuming than looking at a number 10. So sorry, it was a very big question.
Yes. Okay. I've got lost. All right. Let's go from here. So we've kind of established that data might not be what we're seeing in the media. I think that point that you made around we have to separate how data is being used against us in the way that we use data also needs to be a critical conversation point here. I guess what I want to go to is, maybe there's an educator in the room that's like, gosh, I understand the fundamentals of why data is important, but I don't know where to start. I'm a classroom teacher. Maybe I'm teaching English or maths. I know that this is probably important for helping my young people. What are some really simple, actionable things that a classroom educator can collect and use in order to build that data story in their classroom?
Yeah, it's a good question. And also, I'm going to throw it back on that person who's listening right now, because I don't know what's important to you. And it's actually about your context, your kids, the subject area you're teaching, the year level you're teaching. We don't have to all care about the same data. And that's also a narrative that in schools has almost been this assumption that, well, everybody has to care about NAPLAN and everybody has to care about, attendance or whatever it might be. If I'm in a context where my students are coming to school 98% of the time, then attendance data is not something that I need to take into consideration. But if I'm working in a context like a flexible learning context where their attendance rates are generally much, much lower, then that's absolutely something that I would want to be tracking and keeping an eye on, because that's absolutely going to be influencing their success in that subject area or in that learning area. It's also, and I think about my own practice as a secondary teacher. So I'm maths PE trained. For me, I thought, well, what maths data is most useful? I wanted to know how they went in NAPLAN and numeracy only. I wanted to know, say, PAT maths, because many schools have that. And then for me, I thought, well, previous A to E result. And then I thought, well, what's the lead data? So for me in maths, it was, I want to be tracking their homework, because they need to actually be doing the work and practicing regularly, which maths is a little bit different to some other subject areas, and some quizzes just to check in along the way whether or not they're on track to achieving their goals. Now, I was doing that in maths. And then if I'm teaching PE, it's totally different data. And let's not pretend that if I'm teaching touch football on a back oval, that any NAPLAN data relates to that practice. Like, it doesn't. But what does? Well, I need to know that kids are coming to school. I need to know that they're engaged. I need to know that they're bringing their uniform. So like, what are the tracking kind of mechanisms in place that are actually valuable? Like, it's a real return on investment type thing. Like, what's actually worth tracking and keeping an eye on, because that's what we need to invest in. But then equally, as a PE teacher, if I'm then in a theory classroom, then I need to know whether or not they can read and access the text that I want to use with them, and whether they can write at the level that I'm expecting them to for the task. So yeah, sorry, that's a really vague yet specific response to, this is actually about you finding what helps you and what helps you support your students in the best way possible. And that's the data you need to go after.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from this is that it's also really critical to look at the context in the classroom to work out what is the vision for learning that you have in that learning environment. And then once you've established, like, this is the hope, and I would use the word hope or the dream that I have for my learners, what are the interventions that I can track or map or capture that can then help me have insights and transparency on the way to achieving that vision? And so, yes, if you've got a class where nobody's turning up to school, then obviously attendance is going to be something that's really, really critical in that, but perhaps less relevant to that conversation in a different context. I'm interested to kind of move the conversation along, because a lot of this conversation, when we have data, we talk about the stuff that teachers should be doing. And for me, I have conversations with teachers all the time about the fact that if this isn't owned by the young person, the transformation doesn't happen by the young person. So who owns the data and who's using the data, I feel like is a really critical conversation to have here. So how do we transform this from being something that teachers collect and hold to it being an experience that students are a part of and can actually lead themselves?
So my last book's Data Informed Learners, and that really is the goal for me. And it's kind of funny that that's what motivated me, but then I had to kind of go back and be like, well, we need to talk about our confidence, because we need to be confident in the data we're collecting, in having the conversations, in asking questions before we're putting ourselves in front of, an 8-year-old or a teenager, because that's a bit daunting. I mean, there are schools who are doing this well. Like, there are schools who have visualization dashboards that have been released to parents and to young people. And in a perfect world, those dashboards are also being used, say, in mentoring conversations where students are setting goals based on the data that they have access to. So I've seen that work really well, where students are able to see a holistic picture. So in the traditional kind of, in some dashboards, what students have to do is they only look at, so in secondary, they look at like results per subject. Whereas increasingly students are having access to a more holistic picture about lates and absentees and co-curricular participation and all of this, but all kind of represented in one dashboard. And then being able to attach that to their goal setting is really data-informed goals, right? But it's being able to have the conversation and the teachers having the confidence to have that conversation with students. Now, this is another rabbit hole that we possibly don't need to go down, but those tech solutions don't do everything that we actually need them to do. So a lot of schools buy a tech platform that enables that outward facing and the student and parent login, which is gold. There's also the element of the lead data that I'm talking about. That's sitting in individual people's spreadsheets. So that's not accessible to an external view or for an external view. It's something that I keep and I share. So for me, I got to the point many times in my career in the UK and in Australia where I literally had tracking sheets up on the board, like on a whiteboard. Now that's a long way down the journey of getting students to the point of kind of talking about it quite openly and publicly. Clearly I love it, but clearly I've seen the impact that this can have in terms of those conversations, and kids can really start to and I saw this in the UK, kids would start to play with my spreadsheet and go, where can I get my biggest bang for buck? Like, what if I got this score here? Will that get me to that B category or not? But what if I did this instead? And I just love it because it shows, it brings them in. It shows that they've got complete control over what's actually going on. And this assessment is not something that's being done to them that they have no control over. We're just really trying to make it as transparent as possible. I don't know whether that answers your question, but yeah, there's kind of the two pieces, the outward facing and then the internal. It's trickier, but absolutely possible.
Okay, there's a few different ways I can take this. I think what you talked about around the dashboards improving kind of the accessibility of the data is really interesting, but there's another layer to this conversation that's really critical, which is the critical analysis and evaluation of the data, and that I wish or hypothesizing that comes off the other side of it. So I can see the data. Can I interpret the data? Can I extrapolate possibility? And then can I choose a pathway? Now, there's one thing for a teacher to be able to do that, which I would say is a very unique skill set that is definitely not covered in a teaching degree by any stretch of the imagination. And it's another layer to be able to teach that when you're confident in a way that then students could do it. And we do this work with capabilities where we're talking about teachers being able to, set up collaboration in the classroom or creativity. And our data is really clear because I am a self-confessed data nerd. Like if the teachers are not confident in teaching those capabilities, then the young people won't be confident in using them. You can't have compelling curriculum without confident educators. Like it's this link. Where I want to go next is I think a lot of school leaders identify this skills gap that exists for teachers. And it feels like sometimes the plug-in solution to this data literacy and maybe the change that they want to see is creating these action research projects or these PLC type environments where they then feel like implicitly this skills development will happen. Can we touch on this for a bit here? Where are the places that we commonly go wrong in this strategy to build this literacy? And maybe what's a better way to do these processes so that they genuinely do empower teachers to use what they learn through that process to then transfer it into their classroom pedagogy and practice?
Yeah, so geez, your questions are big. They're so meaty. I love them. So first thing I would say is that people, if you follow my work already, you would have seen I have these 3 circles. So we need to build data literacy, we need good visualizations, but the focus is on data storytelling. And when I work with educators, I talk about them developing their capacity in all 3 areas and the staff that they're working with. When we start to talk about student engagement in the data, I'm also saying to them, well, we need to do the same thing for young people, as you've been saying. We need to build their data literacy, their ability to read visualizations, their ability to engage in the data storytelling, and we need to do it for parents. So when I think about data storytelling, I have 2 questions that are kind of my go-tos, and it's what are the trends and the insights in the data? What are the trends and insights? And then what do I do about it? And so when we've got a framework to use, and we can start to use it in our own work with the data that we have access to, that becomes more teachable to young people, because we're then framing it kind of in these 2 lanes where it's like, well, tell me all the things that you see. And one of the beauties of the insights piece and the conversation with a young person or conversation with a colleague is we actually notice different things in the data. So there's no right or wrong way of reading and interpreting it. We're going to see different things. And so, yeah, we absolutely need to upskill young people as well along that kind of journey of the tech. And then I've totally forgotten what the second part of your question was. Oh, action research cycles. Gold. So action research cycles can have a real impact. There's no doubt about that. And I've seen really good people, like people just doing amazing work in schools and being able to speak really tangibly about the change that happens. I think one of the main places and that we go wrong and run into some trouble is a lack of scaffolding and support and structure to what that looks like. So assumptions that if we ask teachers to engage in an action research cycle, they actually know what that means, kind of what you were saying before about the competencies. So when we're thinking about bringing teachers along on this journey and introducing something like that, like I always say, we got to think about our teachers in the same way we think about our young people. Like we would never say to kids, we want you to engage in an action research cycle, knock yourself out, like see you in 6 months. We step them through, there's a gradual release of responsibility, there's scaffolding, there's templates, like we teach them how to do it. And that's the main issue that I see in the work that I do, because it just doesn't happen, and it falls apart, and then there's no follow-up, and then we get to the end of the year and people are like, oh, well, that was a thing that was interesting at the beginning, I was kind of engaged, but it went nowhere. The other, can I keep talking? The other big one that I want to add is people really struggle to identify their baseline data to begin with. So there's two pieces to this. We're getting better at identifying in our data, I guess, some challenges and then acting on them. We're getting better at that. What we're not getting better at collectively is being able to then evaluate the impact of that change. And so being able to, so we want to use data to inform the decisions, but then we want to know whether or not those decisions were actually the right one or whether they had the desired impact. So to do that well and to be able to talk to impact at the end, we need really good baseline data. So we need good information that is stored and collected deliberately at the beginning of an action research project to then be able to say 6 months down the track, we've made some progress in this areas and this is how we know. And then in 12 months time, being able to say our change project worked for these kids. It didn't work so much with these ones. And I guess being able to really tangibly see the change as opposed to just, oh, we did some things and it, I know I'm being very general, but we did some things and it felt like it was good and students really seemed to enjoy it. Like we have so many metrics in our school. We have so much data. We could do a better job of collecting it and being really clear at the start so we can then talk to the impact. And the last little bit I'm going to say on this is that also then makes it far more professionally rewarding for us because as educators, our impact is then more obvious and tangible to us. And it's really awesome. When you see that shift in the data and you can see the change tangibly, it just means a lot more.
Cool. All right. I have a couple of little things that I want to dig into, but I am going to say that if you have questions, please drop them into the chat at the moment. And I'm going to start reading those and kind of flying them into this conversation. I have this belief that you can't learn a capability. We talk, a lot about, these 7 critical capabilities that we think young people need to have a sense of agency over. And one of the things that we talk about is that you can't practice that capability before you perform it if the practice isn't fun. Fun is this conduit to be able to allow for students and teachers to maybe be a little bit vulnerable with the tools that they're using because they don't feel like it's the end of the world if it goes wrong. Sometimes I feel like these action research projects are like these 12-month giant experiments with so much, we're giving you all of this time, we're carving out all of this energy. We sent you to Selena's PD to learn about data, and now we're expecting transformational change in the Year 9 Maths department. And there's nothing fun about that because it's just saturated in accountability and perhaps consequences if the results aren't there. I'd love to understand, have you seen schools implement this data in maybe a more playful way that starts to build teachers' confidence with that experience?
Yes and no. I can't think of a really clear time that I've gone, yeah, I have fun. I always have fun when I'm working with data.
Me too.
But I haven't seen something that I would identify as like a fun way. Like I've seen, treasure hunts and that type of thing. Absolutely, like low stakes, takes a lot of the pressure off, and it does absolutely involve people in a way that feels a bit safer. I think for me, so I have a quadrant model, and in the top right-hand corner of my quadrant model is where we use evidence and we act on it and we can have an impact. And people who I truly see that are accessing and harnessing the evidence they have and they're shifting practice and they're having an impact, recognize that this is not perfect. Like we're dealing with complex human beings in a complex system. This is never going to be, this is the current metric, I'm going to change this thing, and therefore the metric's going to be different on the other end. And almost that fear of failure or believing that somebody won't succeed or that their project's not going to succeed actually stops a lot of people from acting on the information they have because they're worried about what it's going to look like at the other end if it fails. And so I often talk to school leaders about the fact that we need to actually normalize the fact that we're trying to unpick and unravel a whole lot of grey and a whole lot of different colours of wool, and we're grasping at a few of them. And actually, if something doesn't work for half of our kids, that's just as important to learn from and know and understand. Like, that's an amazing learning to then take forward. This is not about, okay, well, every kid needs to have improved in their reading comprehension by the end. Yeah, it's never going to be that simple.
Yeah, I think it's that permission piece, right? Like, I often talk about the best leaders give this unapologetic permission, which is when you bring this idea to them, they say, yep, go and do it. And what I mean by being unapologetic is if you screw it up, that's okay too. Like, you won't have to say sorry if it doesn't land how you anticipated that it would. So that unapologetic permission, I think, is so powerful for kind of diffusing the fear of failure that might sit around a scenario. I wonder how critical it is in this space to scenario plan what success looks like and also what failure looks like, in order to, because I think sometimes we focus a lot on the change we want to make. Is it just as important to think about what a fail might look like in the scenario as well, so that we can maybe pivot faster in the journey and make different decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes into those lead indicators as well, in the same way that we wouldn't want a student to wait an entire term to realize at an end of term exam that they've failed. Like, what are the lead indicators that we're collecting along the way that are giving us feedback about whether or not our change project is on track? Because it's the whole formative versus summative assessment thing. Like, we can do something about the formative assessment data that's coming in when it's coming in. Summative assessment data comes in, there's nothing we can do about it, it's done. But again, that does, like, kind of, as you say, that setup needs to happen at the beginning. Like, you kind of need to know what those lead indicators are going to be. And I don't know about failure at the end, or mapping or thinking about what that might look like. I obviously really like having a goal and the aspiration for improvement or the amount of change that we would like to see. Targets and goals are really important, and at the same time, we know that when we impose targets on other people, they game it, right? So they game the process. So it's useful until it's not. If something hasn't worked, I think, yeah, as I say, like, there's actually so much learning in that. Like, I think you said like a stuff up or something before. Like, is it a stuff up if we learn that particular strategy, it hasn't landed with that group of young people? Because if we didn't know that, yeah, it's like, well, then we try something new the following time.
Yeah, I love that. There's a really great question from Rebecca here, and I have a hypothesis about this, but I'm going to ask the question. Is it better to start with the data goal, then get the baseline, or get some kind of baseline data or some sort of collection, and then inform maybe the intervention or the goal or the impact that you're trying to make? Chicken or egg?
What would you answer?
Oh, so I'm like on this massive, deep, dark hole around capability development at the moment. And with our schools, we get them to benchmark their young people in the confidence that they have across these capabilities. And then we use that benchmark data to inform maybe the capability that the teacher would like to focus on building. So we actually kind of collect the baseline data first and then have a conversation, not just with the data, but to contextualize the data to go, okay, of these capabilities, whether it's creativity or innovative problem solving or adaptive mindset, which one do you believe is the greatest lever that if you strengthened would have the largest amount of growth or impact for your young people? So it's not just about the numbers on the page, because for some schools that are in maybe tricky contexts, working on that adaptive mindset is so important because they recognize that their young people lack resilience. For others, maybe it's that collaborative piece because they don't play well with others. And so, it's the numbers, but then it's also overlaying the richness of the context over the top and then kind of putting the action plan in. But I'm happy to be served a different option here. So I'm here to learn just like everyone else.
No, that was a really good example of it. What I would add is that when we do any analysis, there's kind of two main ways that we would do research and that we would look at data. One's an exploratory analysis and one's an explanatory. And so sometimes we have a hunch and we know that a class is struggling with literacy. And so we go and do a deep dive into the specific literacy data more than anything else, because we know that this is a hurdle, and we can start to kind of see it in the data. Now, that's good until we fall into the trap of confirmation bias. So we obviously need to, what happens is when we go in with a hypothesis and we look for data, we're often, we're more likely to latch onto the stuff that confirms what we already thought than not. So it's important to really test the opposite of the hypothesis, like what data disproves this idea that I have that literacy, for example, is their main challenge. So that's an explanatory. But then there are other times where there's an exploratory analysis. So I would say, Nick, your example is a real exploration. So a few different topics, it could go in a whole range of different kind of directions, and the teachers have got the flexibility to be able to do that. Like in your case, you probably don't have much baseline data other than that survey that you do. So it's important to kind of go, well, and your experience would tell you that there's some areas where kids might struggle more than others, or areas where you work with schools more than you do other topics. But it's that real, like, let's just go and find out what they need, and then we'll design. So yeah, definitely there is no definitive chicken or the egg answer to this. Sorry.
Thought we were going to solve that age-old question. I know we've got 3 minutes left. I knew that we were going to get to the end of this time and it was going to feel like we needed another 45 minutes. Like I knew when I went into this conversation it was going to be the case. If anyone's got any fast ones, they can quickly throw them in. There's a piece that we haven't talked about here that I think might be really important. Sometimes I think in a post-COVID world, the relationship that our schools have with our caregiver community has been, particularly in the secondary space, maybe a little bit tense, right? And so I think it's specifically more so in secondary than primary, because I think learning is a little bit harder from parents who aren't in education to navigate or understand. The rubrics don't make sense. The task sheets aren't easy to follow. There's so many assignments and subjects, and the work has evolved so far from when maybe the parent was at school that it can be hard to kind of capture. How critical is this data literacy for your parent and caregiver community? And is this something that could really transform the relationship in that senior school space when we're talking about outcomes and pathways? That whole parent voice, I feel like sometimes is left a little bit on the side. I'm curious to understand that. How do parents factor in here? How do schools mobilize that segment of the community? Because we've got the kids for 6 hours and then they go home.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, I think data can save the world. So, you know, that's my short answer. The longer answer is, you know, like parent engagement, saying dashboards. Absolutely. Like, why not have parents in on those data-informed mentoring conversations? The challenge we've got, as you say, is their data literacy as well. So I've worked with a few schools where they have released dashboards to students and to parents, and they've created almost like a bank of resources in order, like, for parents to use to be able to access it really well. So they've directed people to specific parts. They've annotated some of the visuals really, really well. And they've encouraged the parents to then reach out to the school if they have more questions or they're struggling with the interpretation. Worked with a school last year where, you know, the NAPLAN reporting bands changed from what they have been for, you know, a decade and a half. And they invited all the parents in from year 3 and 5 to have an information evening about data literacy for the new NAPLAN bands. And it was really well done by the sounds of it, because they basically said to parents, you need to come to this before we'll send your reports home to you tomorrow. And you need to have a conversation with us about it before, because we don't want to send you this completely new metric that you don't understand, because then the questions you're going to come back to us with are going to, you know, they're not necessarily going to be right. And the leader who did this and ran the night said to me that it was a really powerful way of doing it. He said parents really appreciated it. He had a really great turnout. And when they got the reports the next day, he said they still got questions, as you'd expect, but they were much more specific and targeted than they would have been. You know, they weren't dealing with the elementary, what does this mean? What's the definition of strong versus exceeding? Like, that had all been covered. So then they then started talking about really meaty things like, well, how do I support my young person at home if their reading comprehension is lower than some of these other assessments? What are the things that I can be doing to help that? So yeah, love that idea of bringing parents in as well.
Yeah, that's very cool. Justine's got a question. I'm going to give you 60 seconds to answer it, even though that it's a really complex question. So this is my final test. What happens when the data is literally all over the show, Justine's words, and the results are unpredictable, like the students' results? So what do we do when it seems like a bit of a dog's breakfast? What are some tangible steps we can take?
Awesome question. Often when that happens, the data collection has been too broad. So if you think about how a young person would perform in maths and science, or maths and English, for example, they might have really different data. So it's about actually narrowing the focus further into a specific area or strand, and then starting to think, well, you know, is it reading that they're struggling with? Is it writing that they're struggling with? And kind of go narrower rather than going broader.
I don't even think you needed the full 60 seconds. Like, you just nailed it in unders. So well done. I cannot believe it, but 45 minutes has flown. I'd love to kind of close with maybe one tangible thing that teachers could do tomorrow. Like, if I'm a classroom teacher, and maybe the next later is if I'm in this call or I watch this session later and I'm a leader, what's one really easy, tangible, fast thing I can do tomorrow in my classrooms or with my school that can start to move in the right direction?
Yeah, depending on where you're on, like where you are at on your journey, I'd just be thinking about sit down by yourself or with other people and just go, what data do we care about? And if we're focusing on literacy, what matters here in our workplace? If we're focusing on numeracy, what matters? If I'm teaching year 7 science, what matters in my classroom? And so teachers and educators who are doing this really well in schools, they can talk to that. Like, if I sit and talk to them and I say, what data do you collect? They can really easily say, these are the things I use, this is why I use them, and this is how I use it to inform my practice.
Awesome. Everyone, thank you. Thank you, Selena Fisk, Dr. Selena Fisk, for your time today in what was a very rapid 45-minute session on all things data. I am going to put a challenge out there to everybody that's in this call. I want you to plan a lesson at some point in the next week where the young people are using data in your classroom in a fun way. How can you find a way where a young person can own a piece of data in their story and maybe interrogate it or play with it in a fun way? Because I genuinely think if we can start to take the scariness out of data and start to use it in really fun, easy ways, I think we start to build a little bit more confidence in this world to really utilize this stuff in a meaningful way. So let's maybe have some fun with data, and then I'd love to hear back how it went or what you did. So please hit reply. You'll get an email from us with this recording. So if you loved it so much, you can watch it all over again, over and over and over. But on behalf of me, I just want to say a huge thank you to Selena for her time. She is, as most know, a very, very busy human. So I appreciate the generosity of sharing so much of what you know with us today. And everyone else, enjoy the afternoon tea and the dinners. And yeah, we'll see you next time for live learning.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me.